In 1962, the United States Air Force faced an impossible problem. They had built the fastest bomber in the world, but ejecting from it meant almost certain death. And the solution they came up with? Strapping sedated black bears into escape pods and firing them out at supersonic speeds. This is the bizarre true story of Yogi, Big John, and the bears who became America's most unlikely test pilots. The Convair B-58 Hustler was a marvel of Cold War engineering, America's first operational supersonic bomber capable of reaching Mach 2, twice the speed of sound. But that speed came at a terrible cost. When the B-58 entered service in March 1960, it was equipped with standard ejection seats. The problem was that ejecting at supersonic speeds subjected pilots to forces the human body simply couldn't survive. At Mach 2, the wind blast alone could rip limbs from sockets, collapse lungs, and cause fatal brain hemorrhaging. The world already had proof of what supersonic ejection could do to a man. In February 1955, North American test pilot George F. Smith became the first person to survive a supersonic bailout when he ejected from an F-100 Super Sabre at Mach 1.05. He survived, barely. The wind blast knocked him unconscious instantly, subjected him to an estimated 40 Gs of deceleration, ripped off his helmet, his flight gloves, his shoes, even his wristwatch and ring. He was unconscious for 6 days. When he woke up, he was blind, and would remain so for weeks. After 4 surgeries and 7 months in the hospital, he recovered enough to fly again. But his liver was permanently damaged. He could never drink alcohol for the rest of his life. Smith survived at just barely supersonic speed, completely unprotected. The B-58 crews would potentially need to eject at nearly twice that velocity. The stakes couldn't have been higher. The B-58 program would ultimately lose 24 of 116 aircraft to accidents, a staggering attrition rate of over 20%. Crews were dying. In June 1960, a B-58 flew into a violent hailstorm at supersonic speed near Lubbock, Texas. The crew ejected using standard seats. All 3 died. Something had to be done. The solution came from Stanley Aviation, founded by Robert Stanley, the former Bell Aircraft chief test pilot who became the first American to fly a jet aircraft. He founded Stanley Aviation in 1948, and his team designed something revolutionary, an escape capsule. Instead of a traditional ejection seat that exposed the pilot to the elements, the Stanley capsule worked like a personal escape pod. When activated, clamshell doors would slam shut around the crew member in about a quarter of a second, sealing them inside a pressurized shell. The capsule contained its own oxygen supply and survival gear, including flotation devices for water landings. But here's what made the system truly remarkable. Once sealed inside, the crew member didn't have to eject immediately. The pilot's capsule was designed to close around the aircraft's existing control stick, allowing him to keep flying even while fully encapsulated, useful if the cockpit lost pressure or filled with smoke. Only when ready to bail out would the crew member trigger the ejection sequence. The overhead hatch would blow off, the rocket catapult would fire, and the capsule would blast clear of the aircraft. A drogue chute would then deploy to stabilize and slow the capsule, followed by a main parachute for the final descent. On paper, it was brilliant. But theoretical engineering and real-world performance are 2 very different things. Before any human pilot would risk their life in one of these capsules at supersonic speed, someone or something had to test them. The Air Force needed test subjects that could replicate human physiology. Chimpanzees were used for some tests, but they were too small to fully simulate a pilot's mass. What they needed was something roughly the same size and weight as an adult human. Bears, most sources specify American black bears, fit the bill almost perfectly. Their mass and center of gravity matched human pilots, and, critically for the medical data they needed, their internal organ arrangement was remarkably similar to humans. According to Jim Carlisle, a Convair engineer who worked directly on the program, the bears were described as quite tame and given treats before each test to keep them calm. Then they were mildly sedated, fitted with biometric monitoring equipment, strapped into the capsule, and loaded into the aircraft. According to Robert Sutterth, who identified himself in an online forum as the project officer for both the B-58 and XB-70 escape capsule flight test programs, there were 15 ejection tests in total, with bears used from the 8th test onward. Supersonic testing began on March 21, 1962. The first live supersonic test subject was a 2-year-old female American black bear the Air Force nicknamed Yogi. She was sedated, secured inside the capsule in the defensive systems operator position, the rear seat of the B-58's 3-seat tandem cockpit, and the aircraft took off. The B-58 climbed to 35,000 feet and accelerated to Mach 1.3, approximately 870 miles per hour. Then the test began. The clamshell doors snapped shut around Yogi. The capsule pressurized. The hatch above her blew off, and the rocket catapult fired. The capsule shot upward, climbing above the B-58's flight path as the drogue chute deployed, stabilizing the pod against the supersonic slipstream. Then the main parachute opened, and Yogi began her descent. 7 minutes and 49 seconds after ejection, the capsule touched down. When the recovery team reached her, Yogi was alive and, by all accounts, in excellent condition. The Air Force declared the test a success. About 2 weeks later, they pushed the envelope further. A bear named Big John was ejected at 45,000 feet at speeds exceeding 1,000 miles per hour. Again, the bear survived. The Stanley capsule worked. But this story doesn't have a happy ending. Not for the bears. Despite surviving the ejections, the test bears were euthanized after each flight. Medical teams needed to examine their internal organs, hearts, lungs, livers, brains, for any damage that might not be externally visible. The whole point of using animals with human-like internal anatomy was to check for injuries that might occur to human pilots. And not all tests went smoothly. Across the program, some bears suffered broken bones and internal injuries. One bear with an undetected medical condition, hydrocephalus, died from the physical strain of ejection. There's also an intriguing story in the historical record. Jim Carlisle, the Convair engineer, claimed that the bears quickly figured out what was happening. According to a colleague who worked with him, after experiencing being fitted into the capsule, the bears would refuse to accept the pre-test treats. They had learned to associate the food with what came next. He said this resistance became so severe that handlers had to sedate the bears to near unconsciousness, which rendered the biometric monitoring data useless and drove up program costs. However, Sutterth states that no bear was ever used for ejection twice. One possible explanation for the apparent contradiction is the testing process itself. Each bear may have been fitted into the capsule twice, once to measure its physical characteristics and once for the actual ejection, before being euthanized for autopsy. If true, the bears may have learned to dread the capsule fittings even though they only experienced one actual ejection. Whatever the full truth about the individual bears' fates, the program achieved its objective. Now you'll sometimes see Yogi described as the first living creature to survive a supersonic ejection. That's not accurate. As we discussed earlier, George F. Smith survived his Mach 1.05 bailout 7 years before Yogi's flight. The difference is that Smith ejected unprotected, exposed to the full fury of the supersonic slipstream, and barely survived with catastrophic injuries. What Yogi proved was that the Stanley capsule worked. She was the first living creature to survive a protected, encapsulated supersonic ejection, the kind that would let a pilot walk away unharmed. That was the breakthrough. The data gathered from Yogi, Big John, and the other test bears demonstrated that the Stanley escape capsule could save human lives at speeds and altitudes that had previously meant certain death for anyone using a conventional ejection seat. The capsules began being retrofitted into the B-58 fleet in late 1962, with the system qualified for operational use in 1963. They provided protection across an extraordinary envelope, from ground level at low speed all the way up to 70,000 feet and Mach 2. The TB-58A trainer variants, however, retained their original ejection seats and were never retrofitted with capsules. And they worked. When B-58 crews had to eject in real emergencies, the capsule system gave them a fighting chance that standard ejection seats never could have provided. The concept of protecting crew members from the airstream rather than just getting them out of the aircraft became a cornerstone of high-speed escape system design, while the B-58 used individual encapsulated seats, one capsule per crew member. Later aircraft like the F-111 and B-1A took the concept in a different direction, with entire crew modules that separated from the aircraft. These represented distinct engineering approaches, but the fundamental principle pioneered by the B-58 program remained. At extreme speeds, encapsulation is the only way to survive. The B-58 Hustler itself was retired in January 1970, made obsolete by intercontinental ballistic missiles and changing strategic doctrine. But the escape capsule technology developed with the help of a handful of black bears continues to inform aircraft safety systems to this day. The story of the B-58 bear test is uncomfortable by modern standards, and parts of it remain difficult to verify. The core facts are well documented in official records, but some details come from first-hand accounts shared decades later in interviews and online forums. The line between verified history and aviation folklore has blurred over the years. What we know for certain is this: bears were drugged, strapped into metal pods, shot out of supersonic aircraft, and killed for dissection. Today, such tests would be unthinkable. We use computer simulations and instrumented mannequins instead. But in the early 1960s, at the height of the Cold War, with pilots dying and burning bombers, the Air Force needed answers fast. And a handful of black bears, Yogi, Big John, and others whose names are lost to history, provided them.